The first punch caught the chef across the mouth and sent him stumbling backward into a rack of clean dishes. Porcelain exploded across the tile floor, and before the man could even raise his hands, a second fist drove into his ribs, folding him against the stainless steel prep counter. What happened in the next 45 minutes inside that small French restaurant on Rue Marchand would become the stuff of neighborhood legend, a story whispered about in kitchens and bars across Lyon for decades. But I'm getting ahead of myself. His name was Etienne Corval, 41 years old, ran a 12-table bistro called Le Petit Feu on a narrow cobblestone street in the Presqu'Isle district. He was the kind of guy you'd walk right past and never notice. Average height, lean build, kept his hair short, his apron clean, and his mouth shut. He cooked, he plated, he cleaned. That was his whole life, as far as anyone knew, and that's exactly the way he wanted it. The men who walked into his restaurant that Tuesday evening didn't care about any of that. There were 4 of them. The leader was a guy named Marco Stevic, built thick through the chest and neck, the kind of man who filled a doorway and knew it. He ran a local crew that had been leaning on small businesses in the district for almost a year. Protection money, weekly payments, you pay, your windows stay intact. You don't pay, well, things happen. Etienne had been paying. 300 euros a week for 6 months. He never complained, never called the police. He just peeled the bills off his thin stack of earnings every Monday, handed them to whoever showed up, and went back to his cutting board. But 2 weeks before this night, he'd stopped. Believe me, nobody stops paying Marco Stevic. Not in that neighborhood. Not without consequences. The first week, they sent a kid on a scooter to remind him. Etienne told the kid politely that he was done. The second week, they sent a phone call. Etienne didn't answer. And now, on this cold Tuesday in November, Marco himself had come to deliver the message in person. The restaurant was supposed to be closed. It was after 10. The last customers had left an hour ago. Etienne was alone in the kitchen, breaking down a side of lamb, when he heard the front door crash open. He set down his boning knife, wiped his hands on his apron, walked out to the dining room. 4 men stood between the overturned chairs. Marco was in front. 2 of his guys flanked him, one tall and wiry with a shaved head, one shorter with a thick gold chain and a crowbar resting on his shoulder. The 4th stayed by the door. "You owe me 600 euros, Marco said. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. Etienne stopped at the edge of the kitchen doorway. He placed one hand flat on the doorframe. His eyes moved across all 4 men in a single sweep. Not panicked, not angry, just a quick inventory. Get this. He counted their hands first, not their faces, their hands. "I told your boy, I'm done paying." Marco took a step forward. "You're done when I say you're done." That's when the one with the crowbar moved. He swung its sidearm into the glass display case near the register. The whole thing shattered inward, sending pastries and broken glass across the counter and floor. The sound was enormous in the small space. Etienne flinched but didn't step back. Marco watched his face. "That's your first warning. Next one lands on your hands. A chef with broken hands. Think about that." Now here's where most people would fold. Most people would reach for their wallet, apologize, beg for extra time. Most people aren't Etienne Corval. But even Etienne didn't do what you'd expect. He didn't puff up, didn't square off. He did something that confused every man in that room. He untied his apron, folded it neatly, set it on the nearest table. "There's no money here," he said. "Register's empty. I deposit every night." Marco's jaw tightened. He crossed the distance in 3 quick strides, and that's when the first punch came. The one that sent Etienne into the dish rack, and the second one to the ribs. Etienne hit the prep counter hard, braced himself with both hands flat on the steel surface. Broken plates crunched under his shoes. He coughed once. A thin line of blood ran from the corner of his lip. The tall one with the shaved head laughed. "Not so tough for a big kitchen man." Here's what nobody tells you about Etienne Corval. Before he ever picked up a whisk, before he ever learned to braise or sear or reduce a sauce, he spent 14 years in the French military. Not regular infantry, not even the paratroopers, though he started there. Etienne was former Premier Régiment de Parachutistes d'Infanterie de Marine, the RPMA, France's Tier 1 Special Operations Unit. The guys who don't exist on paper, the guys who go where the regular soldiers won't. He'd done 5 deployments across West Africa and 2 classified rotations in the Middle East that the French government still doesn't publicly acknowledge. He left the military at 35, no fanfare, no ceremony he cared to attend. He just walked away, enrolled in culinary school, and built a small, quiet life making food for strangers. That was 6 years ago. He never talked about it. His staff didn't know. His neighbors didn't know. The regulars who came in every Thursday for his coq au vin didn't know. Marco Stevic sure as hell didn't know. Etienne stayed bent over the counter for a 3 count. Blood dripped from his lip onto the steel. His fingers were spread wide on the surface. From behind, it looked like a man who was done, defeated, waiting for the next blow. But if you were standing in front of him, if you could see his face, you would have noticed something that would have made you leave that restaurant immediately. His breathing had changed. It had slowed. His eyes had gone flat and calm and focused on a fixed point in the middle distance. His shoulders dropped a half-inch as the tension bled out of them. I swear this happened. I talked to a man who was there. Marco grabbed the back of Etienne's shirt and yanked him upright, spinning him around. Look at me when I'm talking to you. Etienne looked at him. That flat gaze settled on Marco's face, and Marco, for just a half-second, hesitated. Something in those eyes made a primal alarm go off somewhere deep in his brain, but he shoved it down. He'd been doing this too long to get spooked by a cook. Here's what's going to happen, Marco said. He jabbed a finger into Etienne's chest. You're going to pay me double, 1,200, every week, and if you're late... Etienne caught the jabbing finger, not slapped it away, caught it, wrapped his hand around it and Marco's wrist and applied a precise rotational lock that turned Marco's entire body sideways in a single motion. Marco's eyes went wide. His knees buckled. A sound came out of his mouth that was somewhere between a gasp and a grunt. The room changed. The tall one lunged forward. Etienne shifted his grip on Marco, used him as a shield, and drove the heel of his free hand straight into the tall man's solar plexus. Not a punch. An open palm strike that traveled maybe 8 inches. The tall man's feet actually left the ground. He landed on his back across a 4-top table, which collapsed under him with a splintering crack. 2 seconds. 2 men down. The math in the room just shifted dramatically. Now trust me on this. Etienne didn't look like an action hero doing this. He wasn't spinning or leaping or doing anything cinematic. His movements were tight, economical, almost boring to watch. That was the terrifying part. There was no wasted motion, no fury. He moved with the efficiency of a man who had done this in environments where a single mistake meant a body bag. Gold chain with the crowbar charged. He swung overhead, bringing the bar down in a vicious arc aimed at Etienne's skull. Etienne released Marco, who crumpled to the floor clutching his mangled finger, and sidestepped the crowbar by 6 inches. It hit the prep counter with a clang that rang through the kitchen. Before Gold Chain could reset, Etienne stepped inside his reach, grabbed the man's weapon arm at the wrist and elbow, and hyperextended it over his own shoulder. The snap was audible. Gold Chain screamed. The crowbar clattered to the floor. Etienne picked it up, held it loosely at his side, looked at the 4th man still standing by the front door. The 4th man put both hands up, palms out, and backed into the street. Smart kid. Here's what you need to understand. Everything I just described took less than 12 seconds. 12. I counted it later with the man who told me this story. Marco was on the floor. The tall one was groaning on a smashed table. Gold Chain was on his knees cradling a broken arm, and Etienne Corval stood in the middle of his own restaurant holding a crowbar, not even breathing hard, with blood still drying on his lip from the first punch he'd absorbed. And this is where it gets really interesting, because he didn't continue. He didn't press the advantage. He set the crowbar on the counter, walked to the bar, poured a glass of water, and drank half of it. Then he poured 3 more glasses, set them on a tray, and brought them over to the men on his floor. Mark that. He brought his attackers water. He set a glass near Marco, who was sitting up now, face white with pain, his finger bent at an angle fingers don't bend. He set one near the tall man, who was rolling off the broken table. He knelt beside Gold Chain, and this is the part that still gets me. He looked at the man's arm, felt along the bone with careful hands, and said, "It's a clean break, radius only. You'll be fine in 6 weeks if you get it set tonight." Gold Chain stared at him with tears streaming down his face. "Who are you?" Etienne didn't answer. He stood up and walked back to where Marco was pulling himself into a chair. Now pay attention, because this is where Etienne did something that nobody in that room expected. He sat down across from Marco, two men at a table, one with a broken finger, one with a split lip, and Etienne's voice, when he spoke, was quiet and level, and carried absolutely no threat. "I know what you do," he said. "I know you lean on every shop on this street. I know you think this is your neighborhood." Marco started to speak. Etienne held up one finger, and the man's mouth closed like a switch had been flipped. "I paid you because it was easier than this," Etienne continued. He gestured at the broken glass, the smashed table, the man on the floor. "But I'm tired of easier. I'm tired of handing over money I earned, standing on my feet 12 hours a day so you can feel powerful walking through a door. That's over." Marco found his voice. It came out ragged. "You don't know what you're starting." Etienne leaned forward. "I'm not starting anything. I'm finishing something. You came into my place. You broke my things. You hit me. And I'm sitting here offering you water and telling you to your face, it's done." He paused. "You can send more people. You can come back yourself. But I promise you, and I am a man who keeps his promises, it will cost you more than it's worth, every single time." You could hear the clock on the wall ticking. The tall man had stopped moving on the floor. Gold Chain was silent, just watching through the pain. And Marco stared at the man across the table from him, and for the first time in a very long time felt something he hadn't felt since he was a boy in Belgrade hearing shelling in the distance. He felt outmatched, not outmuscled. Outmatched. There's a difference. Outmuscled means someone is bigger and you can find someone bigger still. Outmatched means the person sitting across from you operates on a level you will never reach no matter how many men you bring through that door. Marco stood up slowly. He looked at his finger, already swelling purple. He looked at his two men. Then he looked at Etienne. "This isn't over," he said. But the words were hollow, and every person in that room knew it. Etienne stood up too. And this is the part that became legend. This is the line that got repeated in every bar and kitchen and market stall in the Presque Isle for years after. He looked at Marco with those flat, calm eyes and said 7 words. "Bring flowers next time. I'll cook dinner." That was it. No flex, no threat, no chest beating. Just a man so completely secure in what he was capable of that he could invite his enemy to dinner and mean it. Marco's face went through about 4 expressions in 2 seconds. Then he gathered his crew and left. Now you might think that's the end. The thugs retreat, the chef goes back to cooking, roll credits. But this is real life, and real life doesn't wrap up that clean. So let me tell you what happened next. The very next morning, Etienne opened his restaurant at the usual time, 7:30 for prep. He had a split lip and a bruise across his ribs, and he moved a little slow bending down to grab things from the low shelves. His sous chef, a young woman named Camille, noticed immediately. "What happened to your face?" "Slipped on a wet floor." He didn't look up from the shallots he was dicing. His knife work was still flawless. Camille didn't believe him for a second, but she'd worked with him long enough to know he wasn't going to say more, so she dropped it. Word traveled fast, though, not from Etienne. From the 4th man, the one who'd backed out the door with his hands up. His name was Dusan, and he was Marco's cousin, and he told everyone who would listen about what he saw that night. The story spread through the immigrant community first, then into the broader neighborhood. A quiet chef dismantled 3 enforcers in a dozen seconds and then served them water. The details got embellished with each telling, the way these things always do. By the end of the week, some versions had Etienne fighting 6 men. One version had him using a frying pan. None of them needed the exaggeration. The truth was impressive enough. And here's where it gets complicated, so stay with me. Marco didn't come back. Not that week, not the next, but he didn't forget either. He was the kind of man for whom a humiliation like that was a slow poison. It ate at him. He couldn't sleep right. Every time one of his crew looked at him, he imagined they were thinking about the cook who bent his finger backward and told him to bring flowers. 3 weeks after the incident, Marco made a phone call to an associate in Marseille, a man named Lazarevic who had connections to much more serious people. Marco wanted backup. Muscle, real muscle, not neighborhood tough guys. He wanted to go back to that restaurant and burn it to the ground with the cook inside if necessary. Lazarevic listened to the whole story. Then he asked one question. "This cook, what's his name?" "Corval Etienne Corval." There was a pause on the line, a long one. Then Lazarevic said something that made Marco's blood go cold. Don't go back there. Don't send anyone. Don't even drive down that street. Why? Because I know that name. And if he let you walk out of there alive, you should light a candle in church and thank God for his mercy. Forget the restaurant. Forget the street. Forget the man. Now, I can't verify exactly what Lazarevic knew. Nobody could ever confirm which specific operations Etienne was involved in during his military career. The RPIMA doesn't publish rosters. They don't issue press releases. But here's what I was able to piece together from people who served in adjacent units. Etienne Corval held the rank of adjutant chef, which is roughly equivalent to a master sergeant in American terms. He was a team leader in the Actions Division. That's the direct action unit. The door kickers, the hostage rescuers, the guys who operate in small teams deep in hostile territory with no cavalry coming if things go wrong. He had conducted over 80 missions across Mali, the Central African Republic, Chad, and 2 countries that his service record lists only as undisclosed. He was decorated 3 times. He spoke 4 languages fluently, including Arabic and Sango, and could pass as a local in half the countries in the Sahel. He once spent 11 days behind enemy lines in northern Mali with a 4-man team, surviving on cached water and whatever they could forage, hunting an Al-Qaeda-linked cell that had kidnapped 2 French aid workers. They brought both hostages home alive. This was the man Marco Stevic had punched in the mouth over 600 euros. Now look, I don't tell you all this to glorify war or violence. I tell you this because it explains what happened next, and what happened next is the part of this story that actually matters. After Lazarevic's warning, Marco backed off, completely, not just from Etienne's restaurant, from the entire street. The weekly collections stopped, the threatening visits stopped. Shop owners who had been paying protection for months suddenly found themselves left alone, and they all knew why. They'd all heard the story of the cook on Rue Marchand. Within a month, something remarkable started happening. The businesses on that street began to recover. Not dramatically, not overnight, but the 300 euros a week that the bakery was paying to Marco was now going toward a new oven. The 400 the wine shop was paying went toward expanding their inventory. The little bookstore 2 doors down from Le Petit Fillou hired a part-time employee for the first time in 2 years. One man's refusal to keep paying had uncorked an entire block's economy. No lie, that actually happened. And Etienne? He just cooked. He didn't take credit. He didn't give interviews. He didn't even acknowledge what had happened when neighboring shop owners came in to shake his hand and eat his food and try to buy him drinks he wouldn't accept. Camille figured it out eventually. Not the military part, the Marco part. She overheard 2 customers talking about it in the dining room. She went to Etienne, who was deboning a duck, and said, "Is it true? About the men who came here?" Etienne looked at her. "Which part?" "All of it. The fighting, the water, the line about flowers." He set down his knife, wiped his hands, and for just a moment, just a flash, something crossed his face that wasn't calm or controlled or composed. It was tired, bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from a man who left one life of violence behind and crossed an ocean of effort to build something peaceful, only to have violence follow him through the door anyway. "I didn't want that," he said quietly. "Any of it." Camille put her hand on his arm. "I know." He picked his knife back up. "The duck isn't going to debone itself." That was the end of that conversation. But something shifted between them after that. A trust. Camille started staying later to help close. She took over the front of house entirely so Etienne could stay in the kitchen where he was happiest. Over the next year, Le Petit Feu grew, not explosively, organically, word of mouth, a mention in a local food guide, a steady increase in reservations. The food was exceptional, it always had been, but now people came for the food and stayed because of the feeling. There was a warmth in that place, a quiet solidity, that people couldn't quite name but didn't want to leave. Now, if you're enjoying this story, if you want to hear more stories about real people who refuse to be pushed around, hit that subscribe button. I find these stories, I verify them, and I bring them to you. That's the deal. Subscribe and I'll keep them coming. Let me tell you about one more night. This one happened about 14 months after the incident with Marco. It was a Saturday, full restaurant. Etienne was running the kitchen with Camille handling the floor. Around 9 o'clock, the front door opened and a man walked in alone, Marco Stevic. Camille recognized him from the description she'd pulled together from neighborhood gossip. She went rigid. Her hand found the phone in her apron pocket. She started toward the kitchen. But Marco wasn't carrying a weapon. He wasn't flanked by muscle. He was wearing a decent jacket, and he'd combed his hair, and he was holding, I kid you not, a small bouquet of flowers. Camille stopped in her tracks. Marco stood just inside the door, looking deeply uncomfortable, like a man who'd rather be anywhere else on earth but had forced himself to be here through sheer willpower. He looked around the dining room. The tables were full. Candles flickered on white tablecloths. The smell of roasting garlic and fresh bread, and something with wine and thyme filled the air. Camille walked over to him. "Can I help you?" Marco cleared his throat. "Is there a table? For one?" She studied him for a long moment. Then she seated him at a small two-top near the window. She brought him water and a menu, and left him alone. In the kitchen, Etienne was plating a rack of lamb when Camille pushed through the door. "Table 7, she said. "You should look." He looked through the pass-through window. He saw Marco sitting alone with a bouquet of flowers on the table next to his water glass. Etienne's hands stopped moving for just a moment. Then he finished plating the lamb, set it on the pass, and said, "Fire table 7, whatever he orders. On the house. You can't make this up." Marco ordered the coq au vin, the signature dish. Etienne cooked it himself, same as he cooked it for everyone, with the same care and the same attention. When it was ready, he didn't send it out with Camille. He carried it out himself. He walked across the dining room with the plate in one hand, set it down in front of Marco, and pulled out the chair across from him. He sat. The two men looked at each other across a small table with a candle and a bouquet of flowers between them. The restaurant hummed with conversation around them. Nobody else knew what was happening. Marco spoke first. "I brought flowers. I see that. I didn't know what kind. I asked the woman at the shop. She said sunflowers are safe." Etienne looked at the bouquet. Yellow sunflowers wrapped in brown paper. He nodded. Marco's jaw worked for a moment. He was chewing on words, trying to find the right ones. "I was wrong," he finally said. "About your restaurant, about this street, about you." Etienne said nothing. He waited. "After that night, I called a man I know. He told me who you are, what you were, and I realized something." Marco paused. "You could have killed all three of us, easily. You chose not to." "I'm a cook," Etienne said. "I don't kill people anymore." That word, anymore, hung in the air between them. It contained everything, a whole life, a career of violence that most people couldn't even imagine, and a deliberate, daily, difficult choice to be something else. Marco picked up his fork, took a bite of the coq au vin, chewed slowly. Something in his face changed, softened, and for a moment the tough guy persona cracked, and underneath it was just a tired man from Belgrade who'd ended up on the wrong side of things and didn't know how to get back. "This is the best thing I've ever eaten," he said. And right then, it was clear he meant more than the food. Etienne stood up. "Enjoy your meal." He walked back to the kitchen. Camille was standing at the pass, watching. She had tears in her eyes, which she blinked away immediately and would deny to this day. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Table 7 needs bread," he said, and went back to his station. Now I wish I could tell you that Marco became a changed man overnight, that he turned his life around completely and opened a flower shop or something poetic. That's not what happened. Real life is messier than that. But what did happen is this. Marco stopped running his crew. Within 6 months, he was out of the protection business entirely. He moved to a smaller town outside Lyon, and, last I heard, he was working in construction. Manual labor, honest work. Was he a saint? No. Did he still have a temper and a record and a long list of things he'd done that he couldn't undo? Absolutely. But he stopped hurting people for money. And sometimes that's the most you can ask for. As for the other two, the tall one recovered fully. Gold Chain's arm healed in 7 weeks, 1 week ahead of Etienne's estimate. Neither of them ever came back to Rue Marchand. Dusan, the cousin who'd backed out the door, actually became a regular at Le Petit Feu. He came in every couple of weeks, sat at the bar, ordered the soup of the day, and tipped 30% without fail. He and Etienne never discussed that night. They didn't need to. Le Petit Feu kept growing. 3 years after the incident, it received its first mention in the Michelin Guide. Not a star, a mention. But in the world of small French bistros, that's oxygen. Reservations filled up weeks in advance. Food writers came from Paris. A documentary crew approached Etienne about his story, and he declined so firmly that they never asked again. He cooked, he plated, he cleaned, same as always. But something had changed in him, too. The people closest to him could see it. After that night with Marco's return visit, after the flowers and the coq au vin and the quiet conversation, Etienne carried himself differently, not in any dramatic way. He just seemed lighter. As if he'd been carrying a weight for years, the weight of wondering whether the violence inside him was all he was, whether the skills he'd spent 14 years perfecting defined him in some permanent and inescapable way. And that night, a man he'd fought had come back with flowers and told him the food was the best he'd ever eaten. And something inside Etienne had finally unclenched. He wasn't just a soldier who learned to cook. He was a cook, full stop. The other thing, the thing he used to be, that was a chapter, an important one that saved lives and maybe took some too, but it wasn't the whole book. 5 years later, Etienne was interviewed for a local Lyon magazine. Small publication, tiny readership. The reporter asked him about his philosophy of cooking. Etienne thought for a moment. Then he said, "Every meal I make is proof that a person can choose who they become. The ingredients don't decide the dish, the chef does." The reporter asked if there was a story behind that belief. Etienne wiped down his cutting board, hung up his apron on the hook by the door, the same apron he'd folded and set on a table years ago when 4 men came to hurt him, and said, "There's always a story, but this kitchen is for feeding people, not for telling war stories." Then he turned off the lights, locked the door, and walked home through the quiet streets of Lyon. Just a man, just a cook, a legend on a street that would never forget the night. A quiet chef showed 4 thugs, and then showed himself that strength isn't the ability to destroy, it's the ability to stop.